almost since its beginning. He's been involved with the World Game and the World Game Institute, where he helped develop the World Game and the Institute. He's a social entrepreneur who works with a variety of large multinational corporations on cutting edge marketing and development. He's lived in Japan, teaches Japanese, the author of 2 books, worked at the Franklin Institute, and as I said, played a key role in the development of the World Game and the World Game Institute. We're thrilled to have him here. He's got a lot of valuable experience in a lot of different worlds. Thank you, Jim, for agreeing to be here. We're all looking forward to your talk.
Yes, and it's great to be here. Hello, everybody. I know some of you have seen me present in prior years, and this will be new content this year. And for those of you who don't know, Ben Franklin is one of the more famous Philadelphians, and maybe most famous for when he flew the kite into the storm and discovered electricity, right? So I thought with this year's theme on electrification, he'd be a good topic to look at. Now, sadly, I was hoping to take some of you on a tour in person of the Franklin Institute and some of the spots in Philadelphia, but since we're doing this virtually, we'll do a little Google Maps tour of Ben Franklin's Philadelphia. And then we'll dive into some of the things that I think make Ben Franklin such an interesting person, not just historically, but for all of us here in the 21st century. And just a little preface, I was thinking about this getting ready. I did my first report on Benjamin Franklin in the 4th grade. I grew up in Philadelphia. So I have been preparing this presentation for almost 50 years now. So this is a lot of Philadelphia fan knowledge here about Benjamin Franklin. You really can't go anywhere in Philadelphia without seeing something about Ben Franklin. What's interesting over the years, there's been more and more different looks at his life and kind of the impact of him as an innovator and as a media personality, if you will. So I think we'll cover some new ground, and I think some of his techniques and principles will be helpful for you guys over the next 2 weeks and maybe beyond. So Ben Franklin, social lightning. We'll dive in and what are his secrets for community development and tech innovation. So the number one thing about Franklin is that he was a doer. He was a great author, but at the end of the day, he was really engaged in all the different institutions of his era, whether it's the politics or the technology. So the doing was the key for him, and he really invented a new world. When on the left here, he arrived pretty much penniless in Philadelphia in 1723 as a 17-year-old. Walked up Market Street in Philadelphia with supposedly nothing more than a loaf of bread, but he was already in motion. And as he hit the center of the little town of Philadelphia in those days, he glanced at a girl, and that eventually would become his wife. So he was wasting no time once he got to Philadelphia. But the leap from penniless 17-year-old to famous founding father is really quite extraordinary. And I think there's a lot of lessons we can look at, and these might seem kind of trite to all of you in some sense, but what makes Franklin so exceptional is the degree to which he really leaned into these 3 strategies, if you will. So he really nurtured his good ideas, and we'll see that in a lot of different ways. He had an incredible ability to harness social networks, so we'll look at that for a little bit. And then he had a great knack about the timing of things. So when he arrived in Philadelphia, he, like I said, he got right to work and started taking advantage of all the different opportunities that were there in colonial America. So we'll do a lightning round introduction. I thought this photo is cool. Franklin, among many things, and after flying his kite up in the lightning, he actually invented the lightning rod. Which in its day was, a pretty important thing, because oftentimes if a building got hit by lightning, it would, the building would catch fire and could burn the whole city down. So, and I don't know if Medard has done pictures like this, but this is a recent Hubble photograph. Each of these little dots on the left is a galaxy, just to give some perspective. And then this little dot here is Earth, a picture of Earth taken from the rings of Saturn. And then this is Philadelphia from the air. And I'll flip over to Google Maps here, and we'll do a quick, if this works, hopefully. So there's Philadelphia. I know some of you are across the other side of Atlantic. And Medard, what are some other continents we have
Well,
today?
Kenya and Uganda. There's people from Tanzania, all over Africa, but also United Kingdom, and then Vietnam and India, New Delhi. So yeah, we're all over the place.
All right, we are well represented. Now, if we had the in-person, some of you are at Chestnut Hill College. This is in suburban Philadelphia, and we'll zoom in. I don't know if you showed everybody, Medard, where we're at. I should, as I'm zooming in, I did work at the Franklin Institute, which is the big science museum in Philadelphia, and it's there. I picked up a book by this guy named Medard Gable, so many years ago, and here we are. But that's a story for a different day. So if you had come to Philadelphia, you would have stayed at Chestnut Hill College.
Jim, we've lost your sound.
No, there we go. Yeah,
okay.
Back. Sorry, yeah, I got a little unstable message. I'm sitting like right next to my modem, so hopefully we're okay. This was Franklin's house. They weren't able to rebuild it, but they had this little wire frame. Franklin invented the Philadelphia Fire Company. He invented the post office. He founded the nation's first hospital where all of my children were born. This is the Benjamin Franklin Parkway. He invented the free library concept of borrowing books. So anytime you go in a library, you can thank Ben Franklin. He was a founder of University of Pennsylvania. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He's also one of 6 Americans. This is the Constitution Center. He's only one of 6 people who signed both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So if you're ever on Jeopardy, that's a good one to know. And he died at the age of 83 in 1790. Just quickly about myself, this is where I was born. This is where I grew up, and we now live in Conshohocken. This is 3 out of the 4 walkers here in Philadelphia. So I'm plus their mother. I am obviously a Philadelphia fan here. Like Medard said, I've lived in Japan for a while, but most of my life here in Philadelphia. So let's dive into some more about Franklin. Down at the Franklin Institute, you can come and see this kind of, Lincoln-esque carving of Franklin in marble, but it's really ironic that he's carved in marble because, as we'll see, he's one of the more shape-shifting characters, always reinventing himself throughout his whole life. So it's a little ironic he's in marble. As we said, he started in Philadelphia at 1723, penniless. Now, just something to keep in mind, and I think people often forget how small the colonies were for the American Revolution period. I mean, Philadelphia was only 10,000 to 15,000 people, so it was just a little town. But Franklin quickly became sort of the big fish in the small pond, if you will. Now, just 25 years later, he had transformed himself into a media mogul, if you will, and a social influencer and a community leader. And a lot of that rests on sort of he really was a genius communicator and publisher. So he came up with this Poor Richard's Almanac that he did every year, year after year. And the genius thing, a lot of people were publishing Bibles in the day, but people would only buy one Bible. Like once you bought a Bible, you would hold on to it for a long time. It's not like you'd stack up Bibles, but so he came up with this idea of a yearly almanac, and that became enormously profitable. So much so that he was able to retire at the age of 42. So that's, so quite a run from 1723 to 1748. He was, by this time, one of the, movers and shakers in the little town of Philadelphia. Now he quickly started branching out from Philadelphia after that. In 1762, I call this his broadband architecture. He designed the U.S. postal system basically, and all the postal routes throughout the colonies. And that was both in the national interest, but then also in his personal interest, because he set up franchise print shops all along the postal route and kind of expanded his business empire, if you will. And then later in life, you can see he reinvented himself again. That the Parisians just love Franklin at this point. He was a kind of a global celebrity. He wore this coonskin cap because the French thought he was some kind of rustic Rousseauian philosopher, if you will. And then finally, towards the end of his life, this probably is the Franklin we all know as the founding father. But you can see it every sort of step of the way. He had this knack for reinventing himself, depending on the times. In this slide, you can just see kind of the remarkable breadth of a lot of the things I just talked about. The fire company, the almanac, he did the Franklin stove. There's the Free Library, University of Pennsylvania, the post office, Pennsylvania Hospital. There's lots of, I didn't touch on lots of inventions and other devices along the way, almost like Fuller or Da Vinci in terms of it, or Edison in terms of his inventive output, his role in the revolution we've spoke on it. And then towards the end of his life, he did bifocals and even introduced the first anti-slavery bills into Congress right at the end of his life in 1790. So just remarkable kind of output, if you will. So how do we do it? What can we learn, right? How to think like Ben. And the main thing, and this is one of his quotes, if a man empties his purse into his head, no man can take it away from him. And I think that in a lot of ways epitomizes Franklin. Like, he was so curious and always trying to learn more things. And we're heading into a lot of economic uncertainty, and there's all kinds of global crises, but it's great for all of you to be here, because this next 2 weeks, the learning you put into your head is going to last a lifetime. So in that sense, I think we're already heading down Franklin's path, if you will, with the Solutions Lab. Now 6200, this is a little quiz question. This is something that happens every day. Can anybody guess what it is in your life? 6200 what in any given day? Any guesses out there? This is another Jeopardy question. Medard, any guesses? Jawaria, Edmund?
Seconds.
No, sort of. It's 6,200 ideas every day is what the social researchers say. So we all have a lot of ideas, and the tricky thing is what do you do when you get that great idea, right? So in other words, most days it's what am I going to wear, what's for breakfast, right? But every so often you'll have an idea like, oh, this would be a cool idea. But the thing, we can take inspiration from Franklin is when that lightning strikes, what do we go and do? And his main thing was he was a lifelong experimenter. It's one of the key takeaways, whether it was flying the kite in the thunderstorm, he invented a stove. He noticed that glass harmonics would kind of make a noise, so he made this glass harmonica piano thing that Mozart wrote songs for. Near the end of his life, he had trouble seeing, so he invented bifocals. And then I think this is one of my favorite Franklin stories. This is a map of the Gulf Stream. So in one of his later voyages, he was well in his 70s or 80s. He was coming across the Atlantic, and he had been across the Atlantic enough times, like he knew some of the broad currents, and he started testing and dropping things in the water. And he basically discovered the Gulf Stream and the whole idea of ocean circulation, just as he was, going along in the boat with nothing else to do. So it just gives you some idea about his experimental nature, right? And I think that's an important lesson for global solutions, is you really need sort of an experimental mindset. And then on the other side of that coin is he would really capture the results. So like when he did his kite experiment here, and this is a little more realistic than this. I should say this is kind of the, Franklin with the angels, the little cherubs helping him here. But it was probably something more like this, right? Him and his son. And scientists and historians, he was pretty lucky he didn't electrocute himself. So please don't try this at home. I want you to be inspired, but don't rush out and fly a kite in the storm here. So the lightning came down and he captured it in this little thing called a Leyden jar. And this was like the early forerunner of the batteries. And they were able to get a charge. And basically what he did in this experiment was kind of link the static electricity that they'd started to play with kind of experimentally in the 1740s and 50s with the lightning in the sky, and kind of made that link, like, yes, it's the same substance flying around. And he wrote it down very carefully so other people could replicate his experiment. And then last but not least, what to do when lightning strikes is tell your friends. So this is Franklin. These are multiple Leyden batteries, if you will. So he lined them up and could hold, a larger electric charge. And this book, it was maybe, some have argued America's most important scientific book of the late 1700s. And it was published in all kinds of languages in Europe, and really kind of made him a global intellectual superstar, if you will. If he had done a TED talk, it would have millions of views, that kind of thing. They didn't have TED talks, they just had books. So the fact that it got translated into all these languages kind of speaks to that. And I have like a modern copy of this. It's pretty fascinating to flip through the pages and see, just all the different types of experiments he was doing with electricity. Now so Franklin had a very unique way of thinking about things and tackling problems and experimenting. He was also America's first social network, and a lot of you know this guy, Mark Zuckerberg, of Facebook, and he did not, I repeat, did not invent social networking. Okay, social networking existed before Facebook. It's hard to believe, but Franklin was really remarkable, and with the degree to it, and this is the social lightning part behind his success. He had this little quote: "Meet often with your ingenious acquaintances," and hopefully in the next 2 weeks, each of you can make a few ingenious acquaintances on your team, or from other teams that you can hold on to. But when Franklin got to Philadelphia, he formed this little group, a small club called the Junto. It was him and 5 other ingenious members besides himself, and they met once a week on Fridays for mutual improvement. And this group of people, if you think back to all those different things that he did in Philadelphia, all those civic, the hospital, the library, the university, et cetera, that wasn't Franklin running around by himself. He'd lean in and get his team of social network people here to help fund or promote or manage all those different institutions. So this was kind of the leverage behind a lot of Franklin's community and civic-based success. So social lightning. He also is a prolific letter writer, and I'll share this deck with everybody if you want to. This professor at Stanford goes into detail. She read all of Franklin's 20,000 letters and believes he had one of the largest social networks in world history, at least pre-digital, for sure. So he would write all over the world, and she was able to map. This is the flow of all his letters back and forth across the Atlantic just in a little short time period. So you can get an idea of just how much correspondence he was doing. So not only did he invent the post office, but then he was sending all kinds of emails, if you will, back and forth all across the ocean to different parts of the world. And just by way of reference, they did another look at Voltaire's letter writing. And you can see, Voltaire was much more kind of a European based thought process, very dense, you can see, but not much across the Atlantic. So Franklin was definitely kind of, on the cusp of kind of this global transatlantic, I don't know, call it civilization, but community, right, of letter writers and correspondents. And then, and by the time he got to Paris in the 1770s, he became kind of that celebrity figure in a lot of the French salons, and was able to put all his wit and social skills to work on behalf of the American Revolution. And it can be argued, like, without his persuasion there in the French court, that, the revolution would not have gotten all the necessary equipment and gunpowder from the French, and history would have been a lot different. So any questions? Because that was a quick run through sort of Franklin's youth, Franklin's experimental nature, Franklin's letter writing. I'll take a breath. Are there any questions? As I keep plowing ahead.
Jim, there's nothing in the chat box yet. I will alert you if you want to continue talking, and I'll alert you by raising my hand saying that there's a question or something.
Okay. All right. Well, I hope you're all being entertained with your as we go along here. It's hard. This is very tricky without a true audience, but I'll keep moving. Now, what I wanted to do sort of in the second half of the presentation here is think a little more deeply about what social networking looks like for us today, right? So I kind of called this section social networking 2.0, if you will. So, Franklin had his letter writing, but there was no Zoom or Facebook or LinkedIn or anything like that in his day. But here we are, and a great quote from Franklin, a true friend is the best possession. And some of those friends, like if you think back to the picture of him as the firefighter, he had a 60-year reunion with the guys from that fire company. He got 3 or 4 of them together, towards the end of his life. So they started that fire company in the 1730s, and they all got together in the 1780s. And I think that's just a nice indication of, Franklin's friendships, ran long and deep, and really all around the world. Now, I had talked to Medard about this slide, and this is true both for social networks, but I think for also a lot of your problem solving this week. Like at the start of this week, you might have a map of the solar system like this, if you will. Like this is the extent of your problem set, and a lot of problem solving, this is nice. Like I want to fly from my rocket from Earth to Mars, right? That's my destination. However, if this is your map, you're going to be surprised, because in the real solar system, there's a lot more depth and stuff going on, a lot more objects floating around, right, that you need to consider to get from point A to point B. So I think this is a nice way of thinking about kind of taking your problem solving skills to the next level, if you will, and thinking about problems more deeply. And I think this is also indicative of Franklin, right? Like he'd start here, but through all his experiments and kind of, plugging away and writing all those letters, he'd start to build out a much richer map of the problem set, if you will. And this also holds true for social networks. So for those of you who have never really studied social networks, this is like a basic social network map. Like there's Don and Allie and Kara, right? And you don't have to have a PhD in social network theory to know that Don is probably pretty influential in this network. Like if Don likes a book and recommends it, 2 or 3 people around him will probably also like the book, right? And this is in essence how Facebook has become so wealthy, is they can predict, like if Don likes this book, then we could probably put an ad in front of Allie and she'll like that book, because Allie and Don are friends. It really is that simple on some level. Now, what's crazy, and I'll show you some examples, is that the social network researchers have found that if Don likes a book and kind of says something about it, Jan over here, even though she's never met Don and isn't really very connected with him, Jan will also probably like the book. And that's what we'll look at in some of these other slides. So the power of these social networks to influence each other is really very crazy and remarkable. So let's dive into that. So when we say going viral, the phrase going viral is a social media term, but it starts with viruses. And sadly, the last 2 or 3 years, we've learned, how does COVID go viral? Well, here it is going viral, right? So it can spread in this group, and then, outbreak over here, and more people get sick, and then super spreader event over here. So this social networking idea, has very profound implications for public health, but not just with viruses, right? So what they found also, and each of these nodes is a person, they found that things like obesity can go viral. So if you're connected or acquainted with a lot of people who are overweight, statistically, that's going to make you more overweight, which is kind of crazy. And then the reverse is true. If you hang out with healthy, skinnier people, you're going to be more likely to be skinny yourself. And again, it's a lot far out on the network. So even like this person out here, if they became really fat, would influence people all the way over here who have never met the person out on the edge. So some crazy effects like that. Insomnia is contagious. This, for those of you who are taking notes or really into this guy Christakis is kind of the leading researcher in some of this extended social network. And he publishes a lot of charts like this. But insomnia, sleeplessness among students, is contagious. So if some of you people in the group who stay up late for this class, you might get everyone on your team to stay up late, right? And you all lose sleep in the next 2 weeks. So you could be losing sleep just because your neighbors are your neighbors on the same team are staying awake. Sadly, in America here, we literally, it's a true epidemic, right? Gun violence, they found, is contagious across neighborhoods and through communities, and they've traced these clusters, and it's basically within a 30 to, I forget the exact stats, but 30 to 50 days after a shooting in a neighborhood, much more likely to have another shooting in that neighborhood, just statistically speaking. So we have a true contagion of gun violence in this country, apart from the bad gun policies. Now this is a little more exciting. On a positive note, happiness and depression are also viral. So if you have a happy friend, that increases your probability of being happy by about 9%. So smiles and warm wishes spread through your network as well. Just on a funnier note, that you can map, this is the social network of Star Wars. And it turns out that C-3PO and Han have the most scenes together. So if you're a Star Wars fan, this is the social network of Star Wars characters. On a more practical note, and this gets into some of this week's, with the technology, some of you might recognize Elon Musk here. This was his first company about 25 years ago called PayPal, which is a big online payment company. But there's this thing called the PayPal Mafia, and about a dozen of the tech guys, and they were all in their 20s, who worked at PayPal, have gone on in Silicon Valley to form all these other companies, right? So there's sort of a lasting network effect. In a way, this was Elon Musk's junto, if you will. He didn't, I don't think he set out with the same intent that Franklin did, but it's definitely had the same impact on Musk's career. Like a lot of the people who were at PayPal helped him to start Tesla and SpaceX, and gave him the credibility to move forward now and make him the wealthiest man in the world. It goes back to his early tech network at PayPal. So these social networks not only have health implications, but technology and business implications. And this one I thought it'd be exciting for Franklin if we were to see it. This is a network of national libraries in sub-Saharan Africa, and all these different libraries are now interconnected. So, not only is it exciting to see all these libraries, but then to see how the libraries themselves are all inter-networked now across the continent. And that, of course, leads us, we're talking about electrification. Here's electric networks throughout Africa. And I imagine, over the next 2 weeks, you'll be looking at, data like this, and then trying to figure out, with this as our base network, how do we plug in play on a more local level to fit into these networks, or, make these networks more accessible or farther reaching. And you can even map problems, right? Like, so as you think about a problem, one problem, this is called systems thinking. I think Medard, you'll probably be talking about this over the course of the solutions lab, but different problems are all kind of interlinked. And if you can kind of get them out and map them and link them, you can start to see like, well, if we fix this problem, it may have a net impact down here on the, further away that we didn't anticipate, but in a good way. And last but not least, about timing, Franklin, did I mention he invented a clock? Of course he invented a clock, right? Because that's what inventors did in the 1700s. So there's Franklin's version of a clock. It didn't quite take off, but you can, there's still kind of pretty cool, timekeeping mechanisms. But Franklin had great timing, and I think as social entrepreneurs and just entrepreneurs in general, or just with your own life, like timing is a key factor, right? So, and Franklin would hit like keep hitting away like on different things, right? So take time for all things, and he was on that electrical study thing for years and years and years and years. And it's just his persistency is kind of remarkable for inventions like that. And then towards the end of his life, this is, I think, one of the first portraits ever of a human being wearing glasses. Franklin invented glasses and bifocals, and frankly, it was because he couldn't see himself. So it was for he was having trouble reading. So he's like, well, I'm going to invent the bifocal, and we still use pretty much the same principle today. In terms of timing, another thing to keep in mind are what we call adoption curves, and this takes a second to get your brain around, but I'll kind of talk it through. So this is the time from when the invention first happened along the horizontal axis, and then the vertical axis here is the percent penetration, right? So TVs, it took about 20 years. TVs were invented in the 1920s here in Philadelphia. And then, but not by Franklin. This is after Franklin's time. But then in the, around the late 40s, early 50s, TVs took off, and you can see the penetration of television sets. And, by the late 50s, early 60s, almost 100% penetration of television. The same with the internet and smartphones. And you can see this almost like vertical, the internet and smartphones have basically zoomed around the world in under 10 years. Telephone took a little longer, right, to kind of get widespread, the adoption curve, the timing, right? Same with the car, like cars took quite a while, and then finally in the late 60s kind of took off. So this is just something to keep in mind as you assess different technologies over the next 2 weeks, is what's the timing of some new process or invention that we'd like to incorporate. Is it really going to be viable? Some people are saying like electric cars and solar are on the same path right here as the internet and mobile phones. So that would be something to consider. How fast are electric cars going to take over different driving habits in different countries? This is kind of the same thing. This is computing power, and this is on the right is sort of the brain, like, this is the brain power. So you can see it at this point on the graph, we had the brain power of a bacterium, then now up to a spider, a lizard, a mouse, a monkey. And they're saying by like 2030, 2035, $1,000 computer will have enough power as a single human brain, right? So this is another one of these timing things. Like if you're doing some solution that requires a lot of computing, that in 5 years computing power is probably going to double, if not quadruple, and you'll have a smartphone that's as smart as a human being. And these trends are pretty stable in terms of timing. Here's some quick mega trends to wrap up, food for thought. I don't go through them all today, but these are ones you might want to talk about in your teams. We'll have internet access, health spans seem to be increasing, augmented reality, the AI, cheap renewable energy, the cost of solar keeps going down. And then the Internet of Things, I think, is pretty exciting in the sense that we'll be able to put little sensors everywhere. These are getting more and more powerful, and they're linked to the connectivity. So for remote monitoring in different parts, say your population is dispersed across the country, you'll be able to put little sensors everywhere and monitor vegetation or how much rain there's been or what's the humidity or temperature and all kinds of things. Also, human beings themselves might have monitors. So, every pregnant woman in an entire district could have a little monitor and having their data sent back. So a lot of exciting trends happening right now. So that kind of wraps it up. So Franklin, and just another thing about Franklin, it's really the first and still maybe the most famous American rags to riches story, right? So he literally showed up in Philadelphia with nothing and invented himself, and kind of in the process invented our modern world as we know it, and the United States along the way. So a pretty good testimony to nurturing your good ideas and your social network and knowing the timing of things. Just another little final inspiration, and this is a leftover slide from last year, but I thought I'd keep it in. Greta, she was sitting here by herself in August of 2018, and she had, it was just a school strike. It was her school strike. She's like, I'm going on strike for climate. It was the Greta climate strike, right? And her parents were like, okay, Greta, and they drop her off each day, and she had her little sign. And just a little more than a year later, 150 countries, she was leading an international climate strike. So there's definitely some non-linear forces out there that, if you hit the timing right, can really be pretty remarkable. And that's hard to predict in your planning, but don't underestimate the power of starting small, right? Because you never know where things might lead. And I think, she wasn't sitting here thinking, oh, well, first I'm going to sit here and then I'll be leading this thing, 17 months from now, or I'll have a global climate strike. Like, that was not her intention, but sometimes things like that can happen. And all in all, Franklin, he could certainly get into verbal sparring with the best of them, but towards the end of his life, he really dialed that back and just sort of was relentlessly positive with everybody he knew, which I think is a good lesson as well. So you can find me here, and that is all. So thank you for your attention. I don't know how we're doing for time. We got about 20 minutes for some discussion.
So Jim, there are some questions that people have asked. I will go over them, but the first thing I want to do is thank you for your relentlessly positive view of stuff. I mean, it was really fascinating to learn. I've been in Philadelphia for many decades and didn't, I knew Franklin held up flew a kite and
right.
Didn't get electrocuted, discovered electricity, but none of the other things. So it was fascinating to learn about him, but not just as a historical figure, but as somebody who we can learn from, which brings up one of the first questions. And it had to do with who do you believe to be today's equivalent to Franklin, if there is such a thing as equivalent?
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question. I think, I mean, there's some easy ones, right? Like Musk or Bezos in the business world. And I have to say, just Musk, I think could take some notes from Franklin on diplomacy. But, Elon Musk is certainly one to nurture his good ideas. So I would say that they're very similar in that capacity. If you think back to, all these, what to do when lightning strikes, right? Like, Elon Musk apparently was driving down the road one day and was like, this traffic sucks. What can we do? And like the next day, he's like building that Boring Company and, trying to make tunnels. So I think in that sense, he's maybe one of the better known examples, in terms of fame. I think there's in the social development world, I think there's, probably dozens, if not thousands of people who are kind of doing some interesting work. And that's, as you Google around this next 2 weeks, hopefully you'll find some of those types. But to answer the question, I think on the macro level, it's probably Musk. Now, time will tell whether he keeps his social life together enough to pull through on some of these things.
So Jim, one of your slides had to do with the pace that things showed
Mm-hmm.
up, how
Yeah.
long it took. And the question is about that slide. Is there a way
Mm-hmm.
to predict these
Mm-hmm.
sort of paths before time? Is there anything we can do to control the curve in any way, accelerate them? Or some of the
Mm-hmm.
curves might be
Mm-hmm.
bad that
Yeah.
you'd want to decelerate, like climate change. But so that slide, any way of
Yeah.
predicting that or
No, no,
controlling?
yeah, certainly predictively. And I think, Medard, you may have sent out some of those videos by Tony Seba in the pre-work, but if you guys haven't watched that video by Tony Seba, he's been able to predict the cost curve for electric batteries and electric vehicles pretty accurately. So in about 2013, he was saying, electric vehicles are going to drop in price to about $50,000 and start being affordable. And he was just following this cost curve down. And the same with the cost of solar panels. Like solar panels each year get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And you can that curve you can draw forward pretty accurately, and just ask yourselves, like, are solar panels going to, 5 years from now be more expensive or less expensive? Well, they're going to be less expensive because we're getting, capacity and volume and better technology, right? So these curves are pretty accurate in terms of predictability. Once you sort of get the enough data points historically. Now to bend the curve, I mean, that, for things like climate change, that's a tougher question, right? Because if you straight line it, Philadelphia is going to be beachfront in 100 years, right? If you follow some of the models. So hopefully we're going to have some kind of interventions or change of course, right? But that's harder to predict, at least from where we sit today.
Another question. You're probably you can be branded as an expert in Benjamin Franklin, and
I guess, yeah.
your work and understanding of him, you may be really one of the few people qualified to answer this question. And it says, what caused Franklin to be so driven? Other than maybe money, if it was money, was it his personality, mindset?
Right.
What allowed him, and those, to turn those ideas that are showing up in everybody's brain, and now I want to do something about it.
Right. That's a great question. He his father, I think, was a deacon in Puritan Boston. So he came out of a pretty strict household. And as much as he ran away from Boston, I think there was a certain, I don't know what you call it,
Social conscience.
social conscience and social virtue in the air in New England in the early 1700s of, like, trying to do good, right? In fact, one of his first pen names was Silence Dogood, right? So I think that was a little bit of his upbringing. And then I think, this nexus of publishing and civic duty and practicality, I think he was always a little bit, I don't want to say like eccentric, that's not the right word, but he wasn't afraid. Like, he would go swimming in the Delaware River in a time or the Schuylkill River, when people thought swimming would, like, instantly kill you. Like, he was a little bit of a maverick in that sense, and I think that goes into his invention. So I can't say what the source of that was exactly, but there was always sort of just this innate curiosity of, like, how do things work, and can I teach myself to swim? And he made, like, little paddles to help him swim better. So like, you name it, he was always just kind of trying to harness the forces of nature and make life easier. And in a time where people just were a little more like, well, que sera, like, whatever God's will is, that must be God's will. And Franklin's like, you can talk about God's will, but you better put a lightning rod on your roof. He made some little quip about that. Like, God probably doesn't want your house to burn down with a lightning strike. So let's get a lightning rod up there. So, there was sort of this practical, let's make life here on earth a little better, right? He was not especially like theologically minded. You won't see many discussions about how many angels on the head of a pin, and how many dancing virgins in heaven, kind of thing.
It sounds like he had a healthy disregard for authority
Yeah,
and or social conventions. I mean, to go swimming when the social conventions was you didn't do that, which suggests that that might be, something. He wasn't satisfied with the status quo. He wanted to change it by bringing new things into the world.
yeah. Well, and this is what makes him so fascinating, right? Because as much as he didn't like that, like he aspired to be like the classic British, lord here. Like in other words, and he moved to London to be at the center of power. He lived in London for 15 or 20 years after he kind of had his business success in Philadelphia. So on the one hand, I think he kind of craved that authority, Madar, but at the same time, to your point, at the end of the day, it spun back around to we're going to get rid of the king, kind of thing.
I think, Jim, that one of the commonalities of Benjamin Franklin with the people that are at the Global Solutions Lab is that they also have a disregard in some respects for the status quo or the way things are. They want to change things. Franklin, saw some things that he'd like to change and went about bringing it about. And I think there's a common element between, his worldview and about change, that it's possible and that we can do it with what the lab is all about and what the people who are at the lab are doing. Um, there's a question, another one, that says, you talked about the power of networks and the nonlinearity in reach that they possess. What do you think is a way to maximize the impact of an idea in the network context using Franklin's insights?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think most of us kind of engineer our networks, I don't want to say by accident, but not very deliberately, right? But like one thing, and I've done this here and there, and maybe not as much as I should now that I'm talking about it, but say like you have a Twitter account, like, and you're tracking down a particular idea, just go out and follow all the thought leaders in that field, right? And maybe start trying to, get a like back from certain people in that specialty area, and be more deliberate about how you build out your networks. That would be one suggestion. I think the other thing, and this is to Franklin's, model, is once you kind of get friendly with that network, share something of interest, in that community, some little observation or useful piece of information. Now he went out at a world-class level, and I think that's some of the takeaway with Franklin and getting this ready was, none of this is really that hard to understand. It's the intensity with which Franklin did it, right? So in other words, he networked with freaking every electrical philosopher in Europe, right? In other words, like he was corresponding, like all those letters he was writing, like he was going crazy with the letter writing. So it's not just make the connections and have some content, but then really stay in touch with those people and get the conversations going. And I think that's what really propelled him, and I think he must have enjoyed it, right? Like in other words, not everybody's wired this way, to have such a social reach, right? Like, and this took effort, right? Like you had to sit there and write I don't know when's the last time I've written a handwritten letter, right? Some of you might never have written a handwritten letter. I don't know.
So
Yeah.
this brings up another question that somebody just asked, and that says, what criteria did he use to choose his social networks? I mean, it sort of sounds like he invented some social networks. The
Yes.
postal system was
Yeah.
suddenly.
And the junto, like, it was a small club, and I don't know, I've read a little bit of detail about these guys, and they were all kind of up and comers in Philadelphia, young, energetic, doing different interesting trades and skills. They called them the Leather Apron Club. So they're a little more entrepreneurial, maybe. So that was his criteria, at least with early in Philadelphia. Later on, as he got into the electric side of things and all the electrical experiments, there was a small existing network that he sort of started to tap into, right? So I think he made one or two friends in the Royal Society in London, and then they promoted him, and he started corresponding with those people. So that, I think, he didn't invent that network as much as kind of tap into the little clique of people who are doing similar work. And it's the same today in any development effort, right? Like, as you dive into this field or whatever area you're going to do the next 2 weeks, like week one, it'll all seem confusing, but by week two, you'll start seeing some of the same names and the same people and the same groups. And they're the ones who are kind of at the hub of that network, right? So it makes sense to try to reach out to them and connect yourself into one of these networks.
So what's happening in the lab is we are forming networks of liked interests, similar topics that we want to work on.
Mhm.
I have a question about that 6,200. I found that astonishing. And what you're saying is that's there are 6,200 ideas that the normal human being has every day.
This is what I Googled, right? You can take that with a grain of salt, but it seemed like they had researched it, right? In other words, and that's just, again, this is not like you've invented an idea. This is like, well, what am I having for lunch?
Okay.
Like, who should I call? In other words, this isn't like I brainstormed 6,200. But the thing is out of those 6,200, and we've all had this, like, we've all had great ideas that we do nothing about, right? So the trick here is, if you get this idea that kind of gets your heart beating a little bit, that's the sign to go out and fly the kite in the storm. Or
so there's two lessons in that that I think you just said. One is to do something about it. You have an
right.
idea, but the other
Yeah.
thing is, if there's 6,200, is to recognize when your heart is beating.
Yeah,
that
right.
this is an important idea. This is not
Yes,
trivial.
right.
This
I
could
better write
make
this
a
down. Yeah,
difference.
yeah.
And Fuller said something similar. There was a study about all the great scientific discoveries. This was back in the 60s, from relativity to Maxwell and, Newton and everybody else up in, the 20th century, that the key to the discovery, it was, I think, a study of Nobel Prize winners, that what led to the discovery was pretty much exactly what you're saying. This is interesting, was that they wrote down, they
Hmm.
had the idea and they wrote it down. It might have
Yeah,
been, when they woke up in the morning or late at night or in the shower, but they captured it. And then sometimes we've all had this experience, like, what was that I was thinking about? It sort of
right.
drifted away. And the idea is that you write that down, you capture it in
Yeah,
some way, and
capture
then,
it. Yeah, and then share it out. Yeah, and get
yeah.
your network activated. Yeah, so I think, I mean, in other words, again, it's not, none of this is like rocket science. It's more, I think, in Franklin's case, the degree to which he was like on a level that I think few of us really can imagine, right? I mean, it's inspiring, right? I mean,
Yeah.
um, you know, I was excited to get this presentation together, because to your point, Madod, I learned a lot, and I thought I knew quite a bit, but every turn of the page, you find out more about this guy. So there's a lot going on there. And I think it's a universal, I know for a lot of people, he seems like some old American guy, but I think these are applicable no matter where you are on the planet, or what century,
It
and
sounds like there were things that he did, procedures,
mhm.
methodology that are worked for him that will also be able to be picked up and put into the current day and work for
Yep,
us.
I think so. That's,
That
yeah, that's the takeaway. Uh-huh.
the network is obviously much bigger today. He invented the postal system, and
Hmm.
now there's a network, but now we've got the internet and all of the various apps that are there for networking people together. But there are other things that we can do besides, elaborate or build a bigger network. Um, it's almost 1:30 or two,
Hmm.
not 1:30, 2 o'clock.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't see any more questions here in the chat thing. So there's two things I want to do, and one of which is to thank you profusely for all of this. I think it was a huge help.